Dawn rises over Ouagadougou International Airport. The tarmac glows under a soft orange haze. Wind hums across the Sahel, carrying the sound of distant drums and the murmurs of a waiting crowd. Sometimes history doesn't arrive with banners or speeches. Sometimes it comes quietly, through the hum of an engine, the glint of a flag, the echo of footsteps along a runway. On the morning of October 30th, 2025, the people of Burkina Faso stood behind the airport fences. Phones lifted, flags waved, faces turned toward the growing sound in the sky, and then it appeared, a sleek white Embraer 190, its tail painted in the red and green of a nation rediscovering its pride. When the wheels kissed the runway, the air itself seemed to exhale. For 2 long years, this ground had known only silence. Other airlines came and went, but none carried the Burkinabe flag. That day, it did again. It wasn't luxury that moved the crowd. It was memory and the quiet return of dignity. A country once called landlocked, proving it was in truth limitless, because this moment wasn't about technology. It was about independence, a nation saying without words, we don't need permission to fly. As the engines cooled and the flag shimmered in the morning light, one question lingered in the air like a contrail stretching over the horizon. Could this single flight mark the rebirth of African sovereignty, one runway at a time? Wind moves softly over the Sahel. The sound of the crowd fades, replaced by the low hiss of old footage, black and white images of men in suits, propeller blades turning against the dry air. In 1967, Burkina Faso was still finding its footing in a post-colonial world. It was a young nation then, dust, hope, and defiance in equal measure. From that belief came Air Volta, a national carrier born on 17 March 1967. 3 months later, on 30th June, its first aircraft lifted off from Ouagadougou's airstrip, a short hop, but a powerful symbol. Every takeoff whispered the same truth: we belong in the sky too. When the country changed its name to Burkina Faso in the mid-80s, Air Volta became Air Burkina. The name was new, the dream was not. The sky still demanded more money than the state could spare, and yet the airline flew on, powered by pride more than profit. Through the 90s and early 2000s, new partners arrived. In 2001, a foreign consortium promised to modernize the fleet to make Air Burkina competitive again. For a while, optimism returned. The uniforms gleamed. The routes widened. But behind the applause, the old problems stayed. Maintenance costs rose, management stumbled, and dependency crept back like a familiar shadow. Between 2018 and 2022, the cracks became canyons. 2 Embraer 195s were leased, then grounded. Debts thickened. Staff waited months for pay. The skies grew quieter each season until, one day, there was nothing left to hear. By late 2022, Air Burkina was silent. No engines, no uniforms, only hangars filled with stillness and dust. For many Burkinabe, it felt like losing a heartbeat, not just an airline, but a piece of identity. Because when a national carrier stops flying, it's more than an economic failure. It's an emotional silence. It means a nation's colors no longer move, a country's voice no longer travels. The newspapers called it the silent collapse. But in the Sahel, silence never lasts long. Beneath that quiet, something began to stir, a sense of unfinished business, a whisper that said, we will rise again. The year is 2024. The runways of Ouagadougou still sleep under the heat, waiting for a reason to wake. Then one morning a new order is signed. President Ibrahim Traoré, young and unshaken, looks at the grounded airline and refuses to let it die. Where others saw death, he saw potential. Where others saw failure, he saw a mirror of the nation itself. Wounded, yes, but not broken. He summons a man known more for action than speeches, Zakaria Traoré, appointed chief executive of Air Burkina. No relation to the president, but bound by the same conviction that self-reliance must start at home. At his first press conference, Zakaria speaks plainly. We don't need to impress the world, he says. We just need to serve our people, and serve them well. A short sentence, but one that cuts through years of bureaucracy and excuses. It becomes the slogan of a quiet revolution. Service over spectacle. The plan is simple, practical, and deeply African in its logic. Start small, master the short routes, rebuild trust before chasing prestige. No long-haul dreams to Paris or Dubai, no illusions of grandeur, just a steady heartbeat returning to the nation's skies. In September 2024, an Embraer 190 arrives. 98 seats. Fuel efficient, reliable. Perfect for regional travel where airports are modest and runways short. The same model that would later make headlines again. That month, test flights begin. Crews retrain. Mechanics return to hangars long abandoned. There's a cautious kind of joy, the kind that comes after drought, when clouds finally appear. Then, on 2nd October 2024, Air Burkina flies again. 2 years after silence, the first flight lifts into a golden morning sky. Passengers cheer, staff cry. For once, every Burkinabe watching feels part of the same sentence. We made it back. This isn't a comeback built on spectacle. It's one built on spreadsheets, discipline, and faith. Zakaria calls it stability before speed. Every decision is measured, every risk calculated. He knows that in Africa, aviation is not just business. It's survival through storms. Behind the scenes, the government supports the revival with maintenance funding and negotiations for affordable aircraft. Instead of chasing Western leases, they look south and east. Brazil for planes, Africa for parts, home for skills. Technicians are retrained locally. Young engineers study Embraer systems in Ouagadougou workshops. For the first time in years, the hangars buzz again. But why the Embraer 190? Because it fits the terrain. It doesn't need long runways or massive terminals. It burns less fuel. It saves foreign currency. It is, in every sense, a plane that understands Africa. Most governments, when reviving a flag carrier, reach for big names. Boeings, Airbuses, Dreamliners, shiny symbols to impress the world. Burkina Faso resists that temptation. As one aviation analyst puts it, they chose sense over show. Inside the aircraft, leather seats gleam under soft LED light. Not luxury, but dignity. For Burkinabe travelers who once paid foreign airlines to cross their own skies, this feels like reclamation. Every ticket bought becomes an act of pride. And unlike before, this Embraer isn't leased, or so the government declares. This is ours, says the transport minister at the handover. Fully owned, fully Burkinabe. Whether purchased outright or through long-term financing, the symbolism lands just as hard. Ownership, even symbolic, is a powerful antidote to dependency. By late 2024, optimism is visible again, not in slogans but in faces. Pilots walking tall, mechanics back at work, passengers posting photos online with captions that read, "Bar, we fly again." On 30th of October 2025, the second Embraer 190 arrives, gleaming in the morning sun. Crowds gather once more as engines roar down the runway. The Minister of State, Emile Zerbo, stands before microphones and calls it a symbol of national resilience. The crowd cheers as if for victory, not over an enemy, but over doubt. The flag waves again, the hangars hum. For the first time in years, the sound of engines over Ouagadougou feels normal. And that is precisely the point. Because this isn't just a plane, it's a statement that Burkina Faso can build, buy, and believe on its own terms. A modest aircraft, yes, but also a manifesto. Sovereignty with wings. Every revolution starts somewhere. Some begin with speeches, some with protests. This one began with a flight plan, precise, disciplined, quietly defiant. As the Embraer taxis across the runway, sunlight catching its nose, a single truth hovers over the crowd. When a nation owns its plane, it owns its narrative. Engines hum again above Ouagadougou, their rhythm weaving into the city's noise. Car horns, market chatter, the sound of life returning. For the first time in years, travelers look up and see their own flag passing through the clouds. The rebirth of Air Burkina is more than an aviation story. It is a mirror held up to a continent still negotiating its power. A lesson in how dignity can begin with something as ordinary as a boarding pass. Running an airline anywhere is difficult. Running one in the Sahel is a battle against gravity and economics alike. Fuel prices swing with global crises, spare parts take weeks to arrive, and every delay cuts deep into thin budgets. Air Burkina knows this well. Its comeback plan doesn't promise profit, it promises consistency. Zakaria Traoré calls it stability before speed, and in practice that means mastering the basics. Reliable schedules, trained crews, and aircraft that fit the terrain. Each decision matters. Buying regional jets instead of long-haul giants keeps maintenance local. Building in-house service facilities saves foreign currency. Even the smallest operational win becomes a declaration of self-reliance. And that self-reliance carries weight. When a Burkinabe technician repairs an engine in Ouagadougou instead of Paris, the country saves money and earns confidence. When passengers board a national plane and arrive on time, they trust again. Trust in governance, in competence, in self-capacity becomes a new currency. At the airport cafe, people talk differently now. They no longer ask when the next Air France flight leaves, they check the Air Burkina schedule first. There's pride in that small shift. A vendor near the gate says, "Before we sold to travelers going abroad. Now we sell to our own people again." For cabin crews, the revival means more than employment. It means representation. A young flight attendant puts it simply. "When passengers hear me speak in Maori or Diola, they smile. It feels like home in the air." The symbolism runs deep. For decades, African travelers boarded foreign planes, paid foreign carriers, and quietly accepted that mobility meant dependency. Now each domestic ticket feels like a small act of resistance, a reminder that modernity doesn't have to come wrapped in someone else's flag. Still, romance doesn't pay for fuel. Behind the optimism lies an unforgiving reality. Almost more aviation margins are razor thin, and one misstep, one engine failure, one spike in oil prices can ground progress overnight. Air Burkina's leadership knows this. Their response is discipline. No unnecessary expansion, no vanity routes to Europe. Every new destination must prove itself sustainable, every franc accounted for. The strategy contrasts sharply with earlier decades when African carriers tried to imitate global giants and collapsed under their own ambition. Burkina Faso's model is humbler, smarter, start local, connect regionally, earn globally later. In a continent where 70% of flights are still controlled by non-African airlines, humility might just be the new form of power. At its heart, the story isn't about jets or schedules. It's about ownership, both literal and psychological. Owning the means of movement means owning the narrative of progress. For generations, African skies were carved into routes that led outward, to Paris, London, Brussels, while neighboring capitals remained disconnected. That geography of dependence was deliberate. It kept trade, culture, and opportunity orbiting around Europe. Air Burkina's return challenges that invisible map. Its new routes, Ouagadougou to Bamako, Niamey, Abidjan, Lomé, redraw old colonial flight paths into something local, logical, and liberating. Every flight that no longer needs European clearance is a quiet victory. Every runway reopened between African cities is an artery restored. Connectivity is not convenience. It is sovereignty disguised as service, and the impact ripples beyond aviation. When goods and people move directly between West African capitals, so do ideas, investments, and confidence. Trade routes that once depended on foreign airlines begin to flow under African control. This is the soft infrastructure of independence, invisible but essential. In markets and cafes, the Embraer's return has become shorthand for national revival. Children point at the sky and say, "That's ours." Artists paint the aircraft in murals, mixing its shape with the continent's outline. What used to be silence has become a new soundscape, the low, steady hum of engines over the capital. The government frames the success carefully. Officials avoid grand promises but emphasize pride and practicality. This is not prestige, one minister says, it is purpose. That balance, emotion with efficiency, keeps the narrative believable even to skeptics. For many outside observers, Air Burkina's story might seem small, a single plane in a single country. But within Africa's evolving conversation about sovereignty, it lands like thunder. It proves that independence isn't only about resources or elections, it's about movement, the ability to decide where and how you go. Because power, at its simplest, is mobility. And for too long, Africa's mobility has been outsourced. Now each Burkinabe flight carries a message louder than its engines. We can build, we can fly, we can choose. Of course, victory is never permanent. The next test will be endurance, keeping planes in the sky when global markets shake and domestic politics shift. Sustainability will depend on regional cooperation, good governance, and continued training. The dream can still falter, but at least it now exists, tangible, visible, flying. In a continent often reduced to headlines of crisis, Air Burkina offers something different, a working metaphor for hope that isn't naive. Progress here looks like a 98-seat jet taxiing under the Sahel sun. Modest, functional, free, and perhaps that's enough. Because dignity doesn't roar, it hums. It hums through engines that no longer wait for permission. It hums through a people rediscovering motion. It hums above Ouagadougou, steady, certain, and home. Above the Sahel, the sky stretches wide and quiet. From this height, the outlines of borders blur. Lines drawn by history fade into the heat. And yet, for decades, those invisible lines shaped how Africa moved, or didn't. For much of the 20th century, African airspace was not truly African. Colonial powers designed the flight maps to suit themselves. To travel from Ouagadougou to Dakar or Bamako, passengers often had to first fly north to Paris. That wasn't logistics. That was control disguised as coordination. Every route that circled through Europe reinforced the same message. Africa connects outward, not within. It was a subtle empire, built not on armies, but on timetables. Now that system is quietly being rewritten. The hum over Burkina Faso is part of a larger rhythm, a continental renaissance of flight. From Addis Ababa to Kigali, from Lagos to Dakar, African carriers are reclaiming their skies one route at a time. Ethiopian Airlines has become the continent's anchor, linking more than 130 destinations. Rwanda Air is emerging as a model of discipline and precision. Air Senegal, Air Côte d'Ivoire, and now Air Burkina form a new constellation in West Africa's sky. Smaller stars, but burning steadily, each one tells the same story: African mobility, owned and operated by Africans. The African Union calls this transformation the silent infrastructure revolution. Because real sovereignty doesn't just depend on flags or armies, it depends on who controls the routes of trade, travel, and technology. For decades, European carriers dominated Africa's air corridors. Air France, British Airways, Lufthansa. They controlled the timetables, the ticket prices, even the narratives of safety and prestige. Flying on a European plane was marketed as modernity. Flying African was seen as a risk. But that illusion is fading. Today's Embraer 190 gliding across West African skies represents more than a national revival. It signals a generational shift, Africans trusting African systems again. Burkina Faso's decision to invest in the regional routes instead of international glamour flights speaks to a new political maturity. It recognizes that power begins not in distant capitals but in local connections. Ouagadougou to Bamako, Niamey to Lomé, Abidjan to Cotonou. Short flights, small profits, but deep significance. Every route reopened is a thread repairing the torn fabric of the continent. Across the map, the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, promises to create the world's largest trading bloc. But trade needs transport. Without direct air links, policies remain paper. Air Burkina's new routes complement this vision, connecting markets, people, and possibilities. For the Sahel region, where land routes are often slow or unsafe, air travel is not a luxury. It is infrastructure, lifeblood, security. Every flight between African cities shortens the distance that colonial history once stretched. And when connectivity becomes African-led, so does negotiation power. Because to move goods is to move influence. To move people is to move ideas. Beyond economics, this aviation revival carries a quiet defiance. It is the sound of a continent refusing to orbit around Europe. For Burkina Faso, that defiance is especially poignant. Long treated as landlocked, it now positions itself as landlinked. What once sounded like limitation now feels like leverage. In speeches, President Traoré frames this shift as part of a wider decolonization, not of politics, but of mindset. Ownership of the skies becomes a metaphor for ownership of destiny. It's no longer about rejecting partnership with the world, but redefining it on equal terms. In geopolitics, visibility is power. Every aircraft carrying an African flag over African soil tells a story of confidence. When foreign diplomats land in Ouagadougou aboard Air Burkina instead of Air France, they arrive in a different narrative, one authored locally. Western analysts sometimes dismiss these gestures as symbolism, but in geopolitics, symbols shape perception, and perception shapes deals. Control the narrative, and you influence the negotiation table. Across the continent, engines hum in unison, not competing but composing. Ethiopia's giants, Rwanda's precision, Senegal's ambition, Burkina's resolve. Each rhythm adds to the same chorus. Africa rising through competence, not rhetoric. This collective movement hints at a future where African airlines cooperate instead of compete, sharing maintenance hubs, training centers, and joint routes. A Pan-African network owned by Africans, efficient, pragmatic, sustainable. It's a quiet revolution, but revolutions don't always need noise. Sometimes all they need is the sound of engines taking off without foreign clearance. Look at a flight map today and the pattern is changing. The old triangle, Africa to Europe, Europe to America, is being joined by new lines within Africa itself. These new routes redraw not only airspace but imagination. They teach a generation that connection doesn't have to mean departure. For the first time in decades, Africa's skies are beginning to mirror its spirit. Vast, complex and self-directed. The Embraer 190 from Ouagadougou may be small compared to the fleets of Paris or Dubai, but it represents a larger question: who rides the future of movement on this continent? Perhaps the answer is already in the air, humming steadily above the Sahel. The afternoon light over Ouagadougou softens into gold. The last flight of the day climbs steadily into the vastness above the Sahel, its red and green tail cutting a calm path through the clouds. Engines hum low, steady, certain, defiant. For many watching from the ground, it's more than a flight. It's a statement that after years of turbulence, political, economic, spiritual, Burkina Faso can still rise on its own terms. No borrowed wings, no foreign timetables, just motion built from will. But pride alone won't keep planes in the air. Every success must now prove sustainable. Maintenance must remain local, training must continue. Politics must stay stable enough for confidence to last. The challenge ahead isn't simply to fly, it's to keep flying, and yet that in itself is progress. Because for too long Africa's stories ended at crisis. Now at least one of them ends with continuity. The hum of engines instead of silence, the rhythm of flight instead of waiting. Across the continent, a quiet movement grows, from Ethiopia's mega hub to Rwanda's precision, from Senegal's ambition to Burkina's resilience. Each engine note blends into something larger, something collective. A continent reclaiming not just its airspace, but its confidence. Independence, after all, was never meant to be an event. It is a practice, a daily disciplined repetition of self-belief. Every flight that leaves African soil without foreign permission repeats that practice. Every takeoff is a reminder that sovereignty isn't a flag or anthem. It's a decision renewed every day. So, when the Embraer 190 disappears into the horizon, leaving its thin white trail across the fading sky, it carries more than passengers. It carries a message that dignity can move, that progress can be quiet, that freedom sometimes sounds like an engine at cruising altitude. Above the Sahel, the sky no longer feels borrowed. It feels earned. And for the first time in a long time, Africa's heartbeat, steady, rhythmic, airborne, hums across its own skies.